thanks very much for the introduction. I'm delighted to be back again presenting the Sonic. I don't come back for the weather, I have to say. It's things that I come back for, so it's great to be here. So I'm going to get straight into it because once again my Linux laptop caused havoc with regards to the projectors and things like that. So I can see things up there, I can't see anything here, so I'm just going to be having to orientate myself towards the screen. So Nosh has already given an introduction to what I do at the ANU, but I wanted to take just 5 minutes, of the opportunity of the captive audience just to show a few slides relating to that. Actually, I'm going to go straight into the presentation. Sorry about this. Okay, I'm going to go straight into my presentation because I've got other slides on the Boson lab that they're missing in action. Anyway, so time is such that it's best if I get straight into the presentation. So what's my presentation on? So it's on the title is Frames with Fields on Twitter. So this is research that has been ongoing with a colleague, Matthew O'Neill at the University of Canberra. And what we're doing in this is we're looking at Twitter, and we're seeing whether or not we can study certain conversations on Twitter as fields. And so I'm going to talk more about what I mean by field and why we might want to do this. But just as a very brief introduction, I'll skip over this slide quickly because of the audience I'm talking to. But our starting point is the Twitter hashtag. And how we can use Twitter hashtags to identify fields and study particular conversations as fields. So we all know that hashtags are used to categorise content on Twitter. There are various interpretations of the meaning of a hashtag. At one end, people regard them as sort of merely sort of tagging, social tagging tools. It's a way of tagging a particular tweet as pertaining to a topic that allows other people to find that tweet and categorise it and know that it's relevant to what they're interested in. But other researchers have talked about hashtags having a sort of a deeper sort of function in the sense that they enable the creation of communities on Twitter. They can be the way of creating virtual sites for communities. So the research that I'm presenting on today is about the hashtag. In this sense, how can hashtags be seen as ways of, or technologies for creating virtual sites for communities? I'm going to touch on some of the literature that is relevant to this work. Barry Rongman's concept of the network individual is relevant here. It's the idea about the individual being empowered to bring about societal change. And it's seen as being increasingly relevant. This concept of the network individual is seen as being increasingly relevant today in an era where membership of formal social media movement organisations has been declining over time. And that was the subject of the work by Robert Putnam, his book on Bowling Alone. And also we're in an era where social media allows people to easily connect with one another. Social media is about reducing the costs of connecting to other people. And it's individuals connecting with individuals. We're also, there's been a lot of talk about the role of social media in the context of online social movements or online social protest or protest on the ground, and how online behaviour is related to protest on the ground. And so there's a whole swathe of research that's looked at how social media was relevant to, for example, the Arab Springs and also the Occupy Wall Street movement. So this is again relevant to the work we're doing. And also the work by Lance Bennett and his colleague Alexander Stegerberg. This idea of, the concept of the personal action frame is relevant here as well. So their thesis is that the shift to social media has resulted in the shift away from a world where individuals became involved in social change via becoming members of an organisation, and therefore they would join an organisation, and the organisation, the social movement organisation, would then be responsible for developing the collective action frames, interacting with other organisations, exerting pressure on government. And so Bernard and Segerberg have, in influential work, have looked at how social media has enabled a shift away from collective action frames. So this is the idea that at the organisational level, the frames have been developed, to what they refer to as personal action frames that are easily adaptable to the individual and are often expressed as a personal story and spread via social media. So their work is in some ways challenging the classic theories of collective action, which emphasise the role of social movement organisations, and they're saying, well, in today's era of social media, it's individualised action frames that are relevant here, and it's shifting the focus away from the social movement organisation onto the network individual. So, I touched on some of the research that's relevant to this ongoing research project that I have with my colleague Matthew O'Neill, who's at the University of Canberra. If I was to summarise our overarching aim for this research, what we're trying to do is investigate whether and how pre-internet theories of collective action can be adapted to the social media environment in which we live today. Is it useful to adapt these pre-internet theories of collective action? And if so, how do they have to be modified in order for us to meaningfully study this behaviour using social media data? And there are a couple of research questions that I'm going to focus on today. Research question one is can we identify particular Twitter hashtags as ways of demarcating the boundaries of fields on Twitter? And again, I haven't yet defined what I mean by field. I'll be coming up to that. But we refer to these, if it is possible to use a Twitter hashtag to demarcate a field, we refer to these hashtags as field hashtags. How do we address this research question? Well, at this stage, it's very exploratory and descriptive, I have to say. What we're doing is we're looking for evidence of structural signatures of field behaviour of fields. And in particular, we're interested in how visualisation techniques can be used to identify these structural signatures and possibly categorise them in certain ways or identify boundaries to these structural signatures. So this is very exploratory, and it's primarily being done through visualisation at this stage. And later in my presentation, I'll be showing you some of where we've got to at the moment with these visualisations. The second research question is, I guess, more straightforward, and it's being assessed using more by statistical techniques. Can we identify particular Twitter hashtags as collective action frames? And again, I haven't yet defined a frame. I'll be doing that in a second. But we refer to these as frame hashtags. And we're examining this using statistical techniques, in particular logistic regression and also event history analysis or survival analysis. So why are we using a field theoretic framework for studying this behaviour? Well, from my perspective, I don't like the idea that, in some ways, that my feeling is that a lot of the work that's been done on collective, on social movements, that predates the internet and definitely predates social movement, social media. I believe that there surely is evidence that parts of this work can be brought into the social media era. I don't think it's a case that we just have to, in some ways, to throw it all away because it predates the internet and social media. So that's in some ways one of the motivations for this work. It's like, okay, there must be useful aspects of this theory that can be brought into the social media era. How can we do it? The other sort of motivating aspect of this work is that I guess we regard social network analysis as a very useful tool. In fact, this whole presentation is basically a network science or social network analysis presentation. But the thing about social network analysis is that while it provides techniques for analysing behaviour and testing behaviour within networks. It actually doesn't, on its own, it doesn't provide hypotheses for the behaviour. It doesn't allow us to hypothesise particular behaviour, and then it provides a technique for testing those hypotheses. And so what we're proposing here is that field theory is does provide certain hypotheses that can be then tested using social network analysis. So what we're arguing is that social network analysis plus field theory is a potentially useful combination in this context. So there's a number of papers that we've put out in the context of this research. In particular, I'll point to this paper here, towards a theory of online field forces. So this is coming out of the International Handbook of Internet Studies, Volume 2. It's already up on the Social Science Research Network. Quite a lot of my presentation today is drawing from this paper, and also this other paper which is still in preparation with Cecilia Perez and Matthew. Okay. So frames and fields. I've probably done this the wrong way around, in the sense I've been using these terms frame, the term frame and the term field, haven't yet defined them. I expect that quite a few will already be familiar with these terms, but just a couple of introductory slides. So the concept of frame is central to collective identity. The term frame comes from the work of Irving Goffman, but it's been adapted to the social movement literature, primarily by Benford and Snow. So frames organise experience and guide the collective action of individuals. So they allow for problems to be identified and addressed, and they provide the basis for collective action. The frames are essentially about identifying what's the problem, what led to the problem, and what to do about it. And so I've given presentations, in particular in sociology schools, where people have sort of questioned how Irving Goffman's work could be, this idea of a frame could be used in the social movements context. And all I can say is put my hands up and say, well, I didn't actually bring the frames into the social movement literature. It's these people, Benford and Snow in particular. So collective action frames, they're intended to mobilise adherents and constituents, to garner bystander support, and to demobilise antagonists. So that's the quote from Snow and Benford. What about fields? So Clanderman defines a multi-organisational field as the total possible number of organisations with which the social movement organisation might establish specific links. So field is a slippery concept, and in some ways what we're doing in this work is we're working out ways for defining a field, or meaningfully define a field in the context of social media. But there's been some very influential recent work on fields by Fligstein and McAdam. So their paper towards a general theory of strategic action fields, they provide a number of propositions, and I've actually just listed 3 of them that I think are particularly relevant to the work I'm doing with Matthew. So you can see that there's at least 15 propositions in their paper about how fields operate. And so the context of their work is not online behaviour. They're focused on fields that exist in the real world. In particular, they look at sort of fields in industrial sectors. Well, that's one aspect of the research. But proposition 11 is interesting. Strategic action fields are destabilised by external shocks. And these shocks may originate from other strategic action fields, other groups, actions of the state, crises, for example. The proposition number 12 is that fields with more connections to other fields have greater stability. And similarly, strategic action fields that are either new or don't have many connections will be more unstable in the presence or as a result of these external shocks. And proposition 15 is also interesting. A new or emergent frame is likely to come from invader or challenger groups. So these are just 3 of a series of propositions that they make about how strategic action fields operate. They've also done work on on the definition of a field, or understanding how to identify a field. In particular, Fligstein's work, a paper from 2013, talks specifically about, how do we define a field? Is the field the same as a network? Is it valid to represent a field as a network? So DiMaggio and Powell, and also Powell's 2005 paper, talk about fields. I think this is primarily in the biotechnology area, especially the second paper, the biotech field. And it's actually a network that they're talking about, that they're referring to it as a field. And this paper by Fligstein questions, the validity of representing a field as a network. What they argue is that networks themselves do not represent what a field is, and networks by themselves do not constitute all there is to a field. In their 2012 paper, they argue that if you look at a network and you remove a prominent actor from that network, then the structure of the network will change. I mean, by definition, if it's a prominent network in the sense of maybe degree centrality, then it's connected to a lot of other nodes, and removing that node will change the structure of the network significantly. But the field may not have changed at all, because they argue that the field is actually, it's not the same thing as a network. It's created by mutual recognition and interaction of all of the actors. And that may not necessarily be changed if an actor has been removed from the field. So they are basically cautioning work which equates networks and fields. However, Matthew and I, we don't share that caution or share those concerns. We argue in this the paper that's on the Social Science Research Network, that this argument does not take into account the specificity of internet sociality. The types of actors that we're studying, in particular on Twitter, really the online interactions are all that we can observe, and they're extraordinarily more visible compared to these offline interactions that may or may not exist. So we argue that in the context of online behaviour, hyperlink and social media networks, where these are comprised of particular types of actors, can be analysed as fields. So I'm sort of just going to bypass that whole argument that Fligstein and McAdam have about you can't equate a network with a field. We say we can. And I also want to pick up on that proposition 15 from that Fligstein and McAdam paper was that emergent or innovative frames are likely to come from challenger groups. This is a proposition that Matthew and I have also been examining for some time now. Actually, you can see that the earliest reference was 2006. That was a Sunbelt paper that we presented there. There's another more recent paper from 2015 that's still in a revise and resubmit status. But what we argue in this work is that one of the rules of the game in activist fields is that weaker nodes or actors are more likely to adopt emergent, they're more likely to innovate when it comes to frames. They're more likely to create new frames, and they're more likely to jump on and adopt an emergent frame compared to the more established actors on the network. So what we're doing is we're arguing that actors who are in a structurally weaker position on the field are more likely to be adopting in this innovation stage compared to the co-option or even the late or non-adoption stage. So, empirical analysis. The data are from a project that I was involved in called Net Badges. This was with Mark Smith, who's well known for his work with the Node Excel software. So for a while, Mark and I, we've got a number of collaborations that have been underway. For example, the Voson software that Nosh mentioned earlier on, we have a plug-in to Node Excel. But for a while, Mark and I were also trying our hand as internet startup businessmen. So we created a project called Net Badges. And what it was a social media badging service. So there's a lot of interest, especially back in 2010, 2011 when we were doing this, there was a lot of interest in badging. So Badgeville was a startup company, we had this idea about badging conversations on Twitter. So this was what the NetBadges website looked like. People would submit hashtags that they were interested to find out who had the the various badges in particular conversations on Twitter. And you can see here that these are the badges that were being awarded to people within particular Twitter conversations. Essentially, this is between-us centrality. So we'd identify all the people who had tweeted using a particular hashtag. We look at their network and we compute their between-us centrality, and these are the gold badges that were awarded. Anyway, it was sort of a fun project. Shall I say it didn't take off commercially, but that's okay. What we had at this time was one of the core assets was that Mark had 2 whitelist accounts for Twitter, and so we were able to hammer the Twitter API quite heavily during this time and collect a lot of interesting data. So between October 2011 and June 2013, we collected every several days for particular hashtags all the tweets, or at least all the tweets that we could get through the free API, but it was a whitelisted free API. We had whitelisted accounts. All the tweets containing these hashtags, the Twitter profile data for these users, and also the social graph, so the follower network of these users. And so I have a data set that I think is quite unique. Of course, today you can collect a lot of this data using the historical API, the historical PowerTrack API through GNIP. And so it's not like these data are lost to us, but I just happen to have a data set that came out of this NetBadges project that I was involved in. And thankfully, we weren't just trying to badge conversations relating to consumer technology. We actually put in some interesting hashtags from a research perspective. For example, Occupy Wall Street hashtags, and another one that these are the ones I'm focusing on in the presentation, is Fab Lab. So this is 3D printing. So we were collecting Twitter data for for about a year and a half for Occupy Wall Street. We started collecting in 2011, October 2011, so that's just a month after sort of that movement was sort of, I guess, started up. And so we're looking at networks here. We have dynamic directed networks where we did collect the follower data, but in fact our networks are actually based on retweets, mentions and replies. Okay, so research question 1, are there fields on Twitter? So as I mentioned, this is very exploratory and descriptive at this stage, and it's heavily, it's involving visualization techniques. So like a lot of people at the moment today, people are interested in dynamic networks and how to visualize them. I'm focusing on using open source tools for this work, in particular the R software. So the network visualizations I'll be showing today are using the NDTV package. There are certain reasons why I'm interested in pursuing open source tools. Primarily, I think it's important for replicability, and also I think I want to be a part of a community who are developing these tools using R. And hopefully I'll be contributing to these tools as well. I mean, I'm giving a workshop this afternoon on social media lab package, which is an R package. But, so I guess I want to be a part of the R ecosystem. However, there are challenges to this. R is terrific software. There's a lot of interesting network packages out there, but is it the best software for visualization of static networks, let alone dynamic networks? Well, I'm not so sure. I mean, in fact, if I were to choose a tool to visualize a static network, I would go for Yeti over and above R. But anyway, the thing is, I want to also be producing visualizations in a programmatic setting. I'm going to be showing you some visualizations that pertain to just one hashtag. But really, this research question is about doing this at scale across a whole lot of different hashtags and trying to figure out, are there, as I mentioned before, structural signatures that can be used to determine whether or not a hashtag is demarcating the boundaries to a field. So is it a field or is it something else? And I think the only way you can do that is by doing it programmatically and doing it for a lot of different hashtags and using a lot of different parameters. And so that's again why I'm drawn to R. Okay, so what are we doing with these visualizations? Simply saying, okay, if it's a field, what do we expect it would look like? How would it operate over time? And this is where the Fligstein work on these propositions about fields are relevant, because they make certain propositions about how a field will respond to exogenous events or shocks. They make propositions about how actors in particular structural positions within the field are likely to respond to an emergent hashtag. So these are propositions that we're arguing that if that's what a field should operate like, then can we see that appearing, or is that how it's playing out in fields on Twitter? So I have some visualizations. Before I go into them, I just want to mention that this is, I'll jump right to this last point. The parameterization for these visualizations is essentially arbitrary. Like any network scientist or person working with big data in particular, what you tend to do, it's very easy to collect networks with billions of nodes and billions of edges. But what you find is that as soon as you've got your data, you start to make decisions about how to reduce the scale and complexity of the data. Because we can't often get much out of hairballs, hairball graphs. And so decisions have to be made. And so, for example, in the visualizations I'm going to show, I'm assuming a 7-day window. So rather than showing, so I have exact timestamps on these edges. But rather than just showing them, the edges appearing every second, or at the actual second that they occurred on Twitter, I'm aggregating them into 7-day periods. So basically, it's a sliding window of 7 days. But then I also have to make a decision about how to regard a link on Twitter. If I replied to Nosh on Twitter today, that's a link, between me and Nosh. Or it's a connection. Okay, how do we interpret that? Well, that's another story. But I've made a connection to Nosh on Twitter. But what happens in a year's time? If I've made no other interaction with Nosh on Twitter, does that link still exist? Is it meaningful to regard that this link still exists? So I guess the answer to that is no. So people tend to decay links. After a certain period of time, they decay away. And so I've assumed 45 days. So unless the link gets renewed within 45 days, it disappears. We have to make decisions about the layout algorithms. So because I'm using off-the-shelf tools, I'm using one of the layout routines that is available within DTV. This is a Spring embedded or force-directed graphing routine called the Kamada Kawaii layout. But I already know that the network will be different with different layout routines. And then finally, how do we reduce the scale of the network? Well, I guess I've already done that. That's what's happening in this step above here. But what I'm doing is I'm presenting networks with subsets of the nodes. So I'm, for example, saying, okay, to be in this network, you have to have had 20 or more connections to other actors sometime during this period of time, or 10 or more connections. And these are arbitrary cut-off points that I'm making. So what the next stage of this research is to investigate more principled approaches for pruning edges to try and remove, the hairball nature of these graphs. And so when I was at Northeastern a couple of weeks ago, I spoke with Navid Dianati about an approach that he's got published on how to prune these networks, and I might be trying to implement that. Okay, so enough talking about the visualizations. Let's have a look at them. So this first visualization. So this is the FabLab hashtag. So it's 3D printing. And I'm just going to show 3 versions of the same network. So you can see here the time periods are days, by the way. But it starts off with what I'm seeing here, and I knew nothing about 3D printing, but to begin with, I saw lots of hashtags that appear to be to do with Europe. So there's Toulouse, Grenoble, but then, and you can see the Grenoble there, the Europeans appear to be quite prominent to begin with. But then I started to see, for example, Maine Fab Lab, Potomac Photonic, which I assume is, again, US-based. Over time, the American-based, so these aren't hashtags, these are usernames. The American-based actors became more prominent. So what I saw there was, it starts off it's Europeans, and then the Americans come onto the scene, and then after a while they're all connected, more or less. Let's have a look at another version. So that version was, to be in that network, you had to have made at least 20 connections over the entire period of time. Okay, so it was very heavily pruned. Let's have a look at another version. So this is a version where you had to have made 10 or more connections. So there's more nodes here. So once again, Toulouse is prominent to begin with. I don't know where Bruneck is, but yeah. So Toulouse is very prominent, but then over time you see, once again, the main Fab Lab is becoming prominent again, and things are becoming more connected. I'll just skew it a little bit. Yeah, so over time it gets all connected, and yeah, once again, main is prominent here. So just the final one looks like this. So this is where almost all of the actors are in there. Here you had to be connected to 2 or more other nodes. And this is where the hairball starts to come in, and it becomes harder to see what is happening. And this is where the limitations of visualization become really apparent, especially these force-directed algorithms, which, at least some of them, in a very dense network, they tend to put the most connected actors out on a circle, like a unit circle. And so what we're seeing here is that, I don't really know what we're seeing. Later on it gets, you seem to get these clusters on either side, and depending on the time of the network, nodes shift across from one to the other. Now, is it the case that, for example, these are the Europeans down there and these are the Americans up there? I just don't know. And this is, I guess I'm showing these not just because they're kind of, and then things get really crazy towards the end. I don't know what's going on here, and I guess this is what a lot of people, I think, are doing at the moment. I gave a presentation on this in Indiana, and I think what we're searching for is the divided day blog analog to dynamic visualization. So Lara Adamesh and Natalie Glass, they came out with a very influential paper in 2005 called Divided Day Blog, where they showed the US presidential, the network of political bloggers in the lead up to the 2004 US presidential election, and they showed the Republicans or the Conservatives and the Liberals. There's political homophily, so it's a very nice visualization where you've got showing connections between the two sides, but by and large they're clustered. And that's a really simple idea because, if you think about it, politically motivated actors, do we expect them to primarily link to people of their own group? Yes. But the thing is that the visualization kind of crystallized it for us, presented it in a highly intuitive way, and in some ways I think that work really helped to kickstart a lot of interest in homophily outside of sociology, because sociologists have been studying homophily for a long time. But really, the economists became interested in homophily. I'm not saying it's all to do with the Divided Day blog paper, but it really, in some ways, that visualization became like the poster child visualization for network science. And I think a lot of us are interested in that sort of aha moment for dynamic network visualization. So, oh, this is why we're investing all our time in doing dynamic visualization, because we can see this, and we wouldn't have been able to see it without this technique. Okay, so moving on. So I want to quickly move on to research question 2. So by the way, as you would have gathered, there's no real straightforward answer to research question 1. It's still very much in an exploratory stage. Research question 2, responsive actors to emergent hashtags. So is it possible to identify particular hashtags on Twitter that seem to play the role of brains, in the sense that they are eliciting a certain dynamic response from actors within the network? So what we did was this is where we're focusing on the Occupy Wall Street data. We looked for hashtags that emerged during the time of our data collection. So they were innovated, or they were created during the time when we were observing the network. We came up with lots of different candidate hashtags, and I think for this research to actually have any impact, we're going to have to do it run the analysis for a number of different hashtags. But we focused on the S17 hashtag to begin with. So it refers to 17th of September, which was the date of the Occupy Wall Street inception. By celebrating this date, this hashtag is used to indicate that Occupy Wall Street is not just a fleeting fad. So an example tweet was 1 year young and just getting started, OWS S17. So this is another kind of, this is I guess a promotion of that hashtag at the time. Okay. So the S17 hashtag, this is showing for a subset of hashtags on the Occupy Wall Street field, if I can use that term. This is the frequency of use. Now you can see here, this is where we are actually dealing with a subset of the data, even though we thought we were collecting everything we could get, because the vertical axis is the number of tweets that use the hashtag, and I'm sure there are more than 400. But anyway, this is what we have, is that you can see the frequency of these various hashtags, or the use of these hashtags, and you can see that S17 did appear around September 2012. And so that was a year after the Occupy Wall Street movement started. So we can't separate out here. There's also the Democrat National Convention that was occurring. So anyway, so you can see here there was kind of a spike in use of this hashtag S17 that occurred here. And what we're doing in this research is we're asking, who was it that was promoting this hashtag? Which actors within the network were more likely to use the hashtag? And the field theory would suggest, or does provide a hypothesis, that it's more likely to be the structurally weaker actors who attach themselves to this hashtag. And why did they do it? Well, they did it as a way, the field theory would suggest they do it as a way of gaining competitive advantage within the field. Okay, so this is where we use, at least in this present work, we're using logistic regression. So we have a binary dependent variable constructed for the first tweet after a person was exposed to the S17 hashtag. So we know when people were exposed to S17 in the sense that someone that they are connected to tweeted using that hashtag. And what we're doing is we're saying, well, after, I think it's for the first tweet after the person is exposed, but in fact we could probably do this saying, well, it's not the first tweet, but it's not the first month after you were exposed. Once again, that would be sort of arbitrary. Did you use S17 yourself? So you were exposed to it. Did you adopt it? Did you actually start using it in your own tweets? And so that's our dependent variable. And we have independent variables, which are the number of weeks since the user opened the Twitter account, the total number of tweets authored to date, the total number of occupied tweets authored to date, the weeks since they were exposed to S17, the number of friends who tweeted, so that's kind of a measure of the level of exposure. We also have information on the community structure. So this is the clustering coefficient. So it's the, if you look at the 1.5 degree network of the individual, what's the density of that network? So these are our independent variables. And so very briefly, these are the results. All else, these are only statistically significant results that I'm reporting here. All else constant, all other things accounted for or controlled for. The odds of diffusing the S17 hashtag are 2.5% lower for every additional week the actor has been in the occupied field. So, and 8.1% lower for every additional occupied tweet authored. So this is providing some evidence for our hypothesis that new entrants, at least here we're looking at new entrants. We haven't actually tested structural position, i.e., using network centrality measures, but it's indicating that the people who are more likely to adopt the emergent hashtag were the people who are new entrants or newly on the occupied field. Also, we find an expected result that for every additional week after you're exposed, the log odds, the odds of you using that hashtag are decreasing. We also find something that might be interpreted as sort of a community effect, that for every percentage point increase in the density of your ego network, you are more likely to 1.13%. The odds of using the hashtag are increased. So actors who are more embedded in the occupied field are more likely to diffuse the new frame. And then also, this is for every additional person in your ego network, you're less likely to tweet using the hashtag. So this work is related to Nicholas Harrigan and colleagues have done work on diffusion of information on Twitter from a social scientific perspective, and they look at this phenomenon of efficient versus inefficient hubs. And I guess we're showing evidence of the presence of inefficient hubs, which, by the way, in some ways is a confounding factor for what we're actually trying to test up here, which complicates things. Okay, I know that we're under pressure time-wise, but I just want to spend just 2 more minutes talking about sort of additional work or future work in this area. Everything I've presented thus far has been a very social network analysis-oriented approach. It's this idea that in the networks there are human actors, these are Twitter users, and they have agency that means that they are creating ties to other actors. They're also using text in certain ways. They're making choices to use hashtags, and that we're modelling those choices. So this is a particular way of looking at the world, and it's a social network analysis or network science way of looking at the world. Increasingly, I'm getting interested in actor network theory, this is primarily identified with the work of Bruno Latour. A lot has been written about actor network theory. I've been aware of it for over a decade. In some ways, I was very interested in the issue crawler software that Richard Rogers and colleagues have developed, but I never really understood where they were coming from. And that's because I have a background in economics, not in French social theory. So for years I was sort of aware of actor network theory, but I didn't know what it meant for me or how it could be used for what I'm doing. I recently found these 2 papers that I think provided for me a really great introduction, and in some ways I started to get a handle on actor network theory and why it might be relevant to the work I'm doing. In particular, I recommend the second one, because they're actually looking directly at actor network versus network analysis versus digital networks. Are we talking about the same networks? The reason why I'm talking about actor network theory here is that the work I've presented thus far, it's a particular way of thinking about the world, but there are other ways of thinking about the world. And this is work with Tim Graham, who's finishing his PhD at the University of Queensland. The thing about social network analysis is that it's about humans having agency, or some sort of essence, essential characteristics that in some ways place them in a different position to, for example, non-human actors or actors. Okay? So in big data research, it's actually hard to know what that essence might be. We don't know anything more about the user than the text or hashtags that person is using, either in their tweets or in their profile. And this is in a big data context. Perhaps we can learn more, or at least something different, via the network of connections between users and hashtags, i.e. the actor network. So I think in some ways there is cause or a rationale for elevating these non-human actors, such as hashtags or text, and treating them differently within the analysis than what we did so far. And then the second thing about the work I've just presented is that I've just been showing you these top-down visualizations of networks. I'm showing you how these actors are forming connections to one another, and then through these micro-interactions, clusters are emerging, and I'm trying to interpret these clusters as fields, okay, or components of fields. But this is a very top-down approach to thinking of networks. Well, in fact, what it is it's saying that it's the idea that micro-interactions lead to macro structures, where those macro structures, in this case, are fields. But the actor network theory looks at it from a different perspective. It's the idea that, and this is where you can read Bruno Latour in his own words. But it's only one way of looking at it. And what they suggest is that the whole may indeed be smaller than its parts. And that's this idea that rather than looking at micro-interactions building up to macro structures, perhaps you need to look at the whole structure as it is. And that's what actor network theory does. So I'm exploring actor network theory in the current work. So I'll finish there. I apologise, I've spoken a bit too long, so there's not much time for questions, but thanks for your attention.
For those of you who are around and might have some time, Rob, would you be willing to take some questions?
Absolutely.
So we only have a little bit of time, but we could take questions. So, who would like to go first? Kiosk.
So, thank you for your presentation, and I'm just interested, and I'm just curious about what other social media settings are possible to you can detect the fields or like frames using the same techniques.
I would think hopefully if we come up with this right, it should be generalisable to other social media environments. We're focusing on Twitter primarily because that's where we have data, but I would think it's, at the moment we'd like to think it's more general than just Twitter, but it has to be, essentially it's wherever people are making connections with one another. I mean, our conceptual framework will work in any environment where you can identify actors, human actors, who are connecting to one another. So that's like a social network type behaviour, and they are producing text, and it's in the context of trying to bring about social change. And in that setting, this approach should work. While we focused here on hashtags as the frames, there's in some ways that's a constraint, and it would be better to think of maybe pieces of text or words more generally, or topics, for example, extracted using topic modelling. So I think it should be generalisable. But I have to say we're struggling as it is just with Twitter, so we're trying to get Twitter that will work done. Yeah.
Other questions? Yes, Esther.
So I'm just wondering how so I completely appreciate your measure of exposure as the first time someone used the hashtag in the person's network.
Yeah.
That's the correct interpretation of what you're doing, right?
That's what we're doing. Yeah.
Right. But I mean, in reality,
yeah, I know, yeah.
You know where I'm going with this.
Yes, yeah.
So I don't know, is there a way to, I know you also, I know you had a measure for how many of the friends used it, which seems like a potentially better measure, but that was an independent variable.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if there's a way to deal with that, right? Because for those who don't know where I'm going with this, just because someone in your network used a hashtag absolutely doesn't mean you necessarily saw it, right?
And it doesn't mean that was the first time you saw it.
That too.
Yeah, yeah.
But,
yeah. No, that's this is the challenge of this observational data. I mean, for another limitation is that a lot of the behaviour that we're interested in actually was also occurring in other social media environments. So a lot of the Occupy Wall Street frames were emerging on another social media platform that we escapes my mind at the moment. But so essentially, I take the point as that it's a pretty error-prone measure of exposure because it's quite possible that people saw the hashtag. I mean, I just showed you actually a screenshot of the S17 hashtag that appeared on a handbill, and so someone may have been exposed to it through a handbill that was handed out at the protest that they were at, rather than on Twitter. So, yeah, I don't have a great answer to that, but I guess it's the way other people, for example, the Harrigan, Nicholas Harrigan's paper. I'm pretty sure that's how they measure exposure. Was it's like you had someone that you're following tweeted using that particular hashtag, so it's someone's following that, and it is a bit problematic.
Yeah, I mean, may I follow?
Please.
So it's an interesting answer, that last point. I mean, I appreciate that you get the challenges. Because we had a speaker a few years ago who, when I asked, a related different methodological challenge, her response was also, well, this is how others do it.
Yeah.
But it's an interesting
Well,
network effect itself, right? So someone uses a suboptimal method and then every other academic copies it. But
what I do is that you can't handle everything. You can't cover everything. So what's
totally appreciate that.
Certain things I'm just going to take as a given. This is where I'm innovating. And that's what we're doing. That decision. Basically, if you don't take some assumptions, some things as given, So some people will reject the work out of hand because they'll say, look, I don't like that measure of exposure. Other people will say it's a bit problematic, but I can see that other people have used it. But what we're really interested in is what other parts of what you're doing. But yeah. So I'd say that's Look, I mean, I think if we could cover absolutely all of the faults in everyone's work, in the paper, that's what scientific progress is about, isn't it? It's like
totally. It's just something those are the kinds of methodological questions I think about it. I was just trying to think, I don't have an answer, what would be a better measure, or how to get around that. It's just an interesting question.
Yeah, sure.
So I actually had exactly the same question, so I'm glad that you asked the question. But I'm going to try to now say, so of course the answer that you gave about the previous scholar is also an example of how often they may have been exposed to bad research before they decided to
I know, I mean, that's exactly it, right?
I'd like to just question this use of bad research.
It's suboptimal. I like suboptimal.
Yeah, but the question is, are they taking a suboptimal situation and saying, okay, certain parts of it are suboptimal, but we're going to innovate in other parts.
Yes.
We're going to extend the field in other ways. Because at the end of the day, someone can always say,
sure.
It can attack all aspects of what you're doing, and it just depends on whether the assumptions that you're making are non-starters to the audience.
So I agree, and I understand we all are guilty of trying to sub-optimize some parts while trying to innovate.
So focus on the stuff that we're interested in.
Sure, yeah. But I'm thinking whether you could draw upon the work that's done on threshold models in diffusion to see if you could make an argument that rather than exposure being defined as to the first time someone in your network used it, that you look instead at some kind of think of the work of people like Michael Macy, David Santola, etc., who say, in fact, it's not the first time, but once you build some cumulative number, then you have the final straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak. So is there a way to try to look for if there are better fitting models which say that after X number of people in your network tweeted it, chances are at least you got to see it once. Actually got to see it, right? And maybe more than once, which might provide a more robust defense against the suggestion that if you have just look for one hashtag in the fire hose, that's almost impossible to guarantee that. So I wonder if that would be one way to try to...
I agree, and I think that ultimately that's, as far as I know, to the extent that you're wanting to model this behaviour using observational data, you're going to have to make assumptions, and what you're going to do is test a range of assumptions
Yeah.
about, and see whether or not your results are robust to that. So I just presented a particular naive, I guess, approach. But I think you're right. We could explore other ways of saying, okay, some, I guess, thresholds, and then saying, okay, if we're finding something interesting with this particular approach, does it completely fall away once we've expanded our definition of what exposure is? And if it does fall away, then I think we've got something that's not robust.
It's right, that's what it's best to robust.
Exactly, yes.
Yeah. Other questions? Yes. Natalie?
Do you look at if someone likes the tweet? Like, that might be a measure if they see it or...
No, I don't even know if Twitter had the like functionality. If they do, I'm not sure we were collecting it at the time. Yeah. But I think it's a good point.
Great. Okay, well, I know that several of you actually have scheduled meetings with Rob where you'll be able to continue the conversation with him. So again, join me in thanking Rob. And oh, yes, and Rob, we have a small tradition here that I don't think we had the last time you came.
That's why I came back again.
Here's an old-fashioned, low-tech writing instrument.
Oh, thank you very much.
And you could use to sketch network visualization, static network visualization.
Thanks very much. Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
So,
Yeah, I am. So I'm looking around, or I don't know how long he'll wrap up here. So.
Yeah.
you want to head back? I'll bring them down.
Okay, great.
See it.
Yeah, that's for that purpose of